Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this is my next video on non-competes, why capitalism sucks. This is the first video, so I've actually done the whole process of reviewing his videos backwards. So I did his last video first, then I did his second video, and it was, I admit, I messed up. I did it in weird order. But I'm going to finally address his very first video in his series of why capitalism sucks. And it sort of sets the foundation for the videos that I've already done and already reviewed. Part of the reason why I reviewed them in reverse order is I discovered his channel in the third video. So it's kind of what, that's life. Sometimes you find things out of order. So yeah, that's where we are now in this case. So with that in mind, I want you to understand that this video that I'm going to present right now is really the first, and it's probably the one you should check out first when you're watching his series. So he starts out explaining how capitalism arose. He explains that it came out of the feudalist system, which was really a very rough system for most people, because there was the feudal lords, and then there was the merchant class and the religious class, and then there was the rest of humanity, which was basically peasant class. And it was pretty crappy to be in the peasant class. You're basically a slave to the feudal lords. And there was no mobility between the different groups. It was pretty stagnant. And it was a tough time to live. Now capitalism changed that. It sort of, and he says that it was swept away by capitalism. There was actually some basic forms of capitalism much longer than the capitalism we know today, but capitalism as a complete system where all levels are exposed to it has really just arisen recently. And since it has arisen, within like the last 200 years, if you adjust for inflation, the 99% of the people on the planet were living on less than $1 a day, compared to now, where that number is like less than 20% of the world's population. So 80% of the world's population has been brought out of poverty by capitalism. And he actually mentions that capitalism was a successful system, but then he goes one step further and says that it's gone too far. And I'll let him present his arguments, and then I'm going to rebut them. So let's listen to his video now.
Over time, capitalist processes lead to increasing economic instability, inequality, and societal destruction. To understand why, let's take a look at how capitalism functions. Under capitalism, all of the old classes of lords and peasants and craftsmen and merchants have been swept away. Now there are basically just two major classes: the capitalists who own the means of production, the factories and farms and other businesses of the world, and the workers who perform the labor that keeps the wheels of the economy turning. Capitalists not only own the means of production, but they also get to keep a significant cut of whatever the worker earns or produces in the form of profit. Basically, capitalist bosses steal labor value from workers and transfer that wealth to themselves. In order for capitalist institutions to survive, they have to turn a profit for the capitalists who own them. Otherwise, they'll be forced out of business by more ruthless competitors. Capitalist institutions literally can't concern themselves with anything but profits, or basically they'll die.
So that was kind of interesting. So he sets up the premise that capitalists are only concerned with profit. That's the only thing that matters to them. If they don't get profit, then they will go out of business. Well, to a certain extent, he's right. That is true, that in order to survive as a capitalist, you need to make a profit. But it's not your only concern. You still have to produce a good product. You still have to understand your employees and embrace your employees in terms of making sure that they have a good working environment. Because if they don't, well, there's a capitalist model that involves the workers maybe leaving your company, and that can be very expensive to your company. So one of my philosophies, and this is a very simple philosophy that explains capitalism in a very simple, in a very easy way that hopefully even a socialist can understand, is that there's three things that a capitalist must do. They must appeal to these three groups. One, he must appeal to the shareholders, the people that have invested in his company, and to himself, that the people that provided the capital for the business. He must be a cognizant of the profits of the business. He must be aware of the profit. So that first group is very important. But equally important is another group, which is the customer. Now, if he produces a product that nobody likes, well, his business is going to go out of business. If he makes his customers sick, or he does something that hurts his customers, well, then he'll go out of business. So he has to be equally aware of making his customers happy. And usually socialists will say, well, the way that they do that is they reduce the price. Price is not everything. And that's really important to understand. Most socialists don't understand that price isn't everything. It's only one of many things that determine whether somebody buys product A or product B. A good example of this is the luxury goods industry. It's not that they're fighting on who can be the cheapest. They're fighting on who can be the best, who provide the most luxurious, or the most elegant, or the most something where people can say, wow, if I own this, I've bought a bit of luxury. And so price isn't really that important in that case. So there's many factors. It's not just about price. And this is the mistake that socialists make. They focus on the one issue rather than understanding that there's many things that determine whether or not that customer is happy. So as I said, there's now two things that the capitalist has to be aware of. The profit, or making the shareholders happy. Second thing is being aware of the customer and the customer's needs. Now the third thing is actually just as important as the other two. It's the actual employees. If you do not make your employees happy, you will be out of business. If you do not make your employees feel secure with their job, if you do not make them feel like they should produce good quality stuff, they will produce bad quality stuff. Creating that philosophy within your company that makes them happy with their work and happily producing for you, then you will get good results from them. A good example of this is if you ever go to Walt Disney, the actual theme parks, it's really interesting. All the employees are happy. They have this happiness to them. They speak to you very politely. They talk to you as if you are somebody that they like. And it's really high customer service experience when you go to a Disney theme park. And it's not that they're being whipped in order to do this. They're generally happy. It might not be the best job in the world, but at least it's a happy place. And when all the workers are acting happy, and it kind of becomes contagious within the employees that they actually feel happy. So this is a very important thing, and it's something that people don't understand that are socialists. They think that the capitalist is just trying to work and squeeze their worker to death. One of the images that he showed was literally two capitalists squeezing the worker in order to get every ounce out of them. But that just doesn't work. If you ignore these three groups as a capitalist, you will be out of business. And it has happened. It happens all the time where companies will ignore one of the three things and they'll go out of business. So capitalists, their position is very precarious because they have to support these three things. And sometimes those three things come in conflict with each other. Sometimes it's hard to create profits when you're worried about making your employees happy and having to pay them more than sometimes that they're actually worth because you have to make them happy. And if you do that, you sacrifice profits, and that can come in a big cost too. So it's a real conflict keeping those three things balanced, but you have to do it. So I'm going to play more of his video now, and I'll give more points to explain how capitalism really works and to show the flaws in his logic.
Nearly all of the efforts of human civilization are now yoked to the will of capitalists who own the factories, the financial institutions, the mass media, the social networks, the tech companies, the medical and pharmaceutical companies. They own everything, so they get to set the agenda for our society. And what kind of agenda do capitalists have? Well, it's actually really simple. Capitalism steers humanity toward one end and one end only: ever-increasing profits for capitalists. See, capitalists don't really care about the welfare of workers or protecting the environment. They can't, because those things aren't profitable. Capitalism doesn't allow for businesses to be driven by ethics or morals or scruples. Only building profits will allow a company to survive. Anything that reduces profitability is inherently harmful to a capitalist entity. Sure, sometimes profitability does line up with good causes. Sometimes it's cheaper to be more environmentally sustainable, for instance, or maybe donating to a charity will net a big fat tax break for the capitalist, or maybe it's just good marketing to support a worthy cause. But this is all just incidental. Don't be fooled for a moment into believing that capitalism cares about the welfare of society. It's all about the profit. Keep in mind that there are only two ways to increase profits. A company can either increase prices for consumers or reduce costs. Competition tends to put a hard limit on what a business can charge, so as businesses become more powerful, they will always seek to eliminate competition and create monopolies so that they can charge consumers as much as possible to maximize company profits. When it comes to driving down costs, the primary cost for almost every business is human labor. As such, capitalist businesses are always seeking to pay workers as little as possible or just eliminate them through things like automation to drive down wages as much as they can get away with.
So he basically mentions that there's only two ways that a capitalist can make a profit, and that's all they're concerned with. So as I explained, that's not all a capitalist is concerned with. So let's look at his two ways. One is to increase the price. If you increase the price, then you can increase the profits. Two is to lower wages. So it's a very simplistic version of reality where the capitalist has only really two options to determine the how much they can make, and their goal is to make more money, right? So let's think about those two things. It's almost hilarious to hear those as only options that the capitalist has. So one, let's increasing prices. Well, we know that capitalists generally don't do that. As capitalism gets going, it actually reduces prices. So we know that that's not the method they use, because historically speaking, prices have actually gone down. And creating a monopoly is actually very, very difficult. I'm going to do a whole video on creating monopolies. I'm going to teach people how to create a monopoly, and you'll see that it's pretty much impossible unless the government helps you. So creating a monopoly isn't something that a business can really do, because they're always, as I said, the three pillars. The customer can always say they want something different, and because they have that, customer has so much power over the capitalist. They're at the whim of other companies coming in and providing something that can lead those customers away from them. So there's always competition in a free market system. So it can't be that first one that he said. Let's look at the second one. The second one is, he says the only way they can increase profit is to reduce costs. And how do you reduce costs? Well, you squeeze those employees, really whip them hard, make sure that they basically are slaves. And that's the way socialists think, that workers are basically slaves to the capitalists. And that is just so crazy. What capitalists actually do, and the reason they actually pay their employees more over time, instead of less is that they increase the value of their employees. Now, there's many ways capitalists can do this. One is they can buy technology, like he mentions automation. But automation isn't done in order to remove jobs. It's actually done to enhance jobs. And there's a big difference in that. So what you do is you get, like, if you can give your employee a machine that can make him twice as productive, well, that's a good thing to do. Makes their job easier and makes that employee way more productive. So automation is usually done in that way of thinking, that it enhances the worker's job and their ability to produce value. So employers don't need to pay them less in order to achieve this. They can actually pay them more and just increase their value so that they can generate more value for the company. The more value your employees can generate, the better. And it doesn't mean that they have to work longer hours or anything like that. As I said, automation can do this. And even skill training can do this. And helping your workers become more proficient at their job and making it simple to do their job as well. So there's many things that capitalists can do to actually increase their employees' value without having to decrease the amount you pay those employees. Okay, so that's big misconception that socialists have about how capitalism works. So basically both of those things don't really make any sense. Totally bogus arguments. So let's continue his video.
Naturally, this leads to tremendous accumulation of wealth for the capitalist class and ever-increasing wealth inequality between workers and capitalists. By definition, capitalism will always lead to the rich getting richer and the poor getting way more poor. A lot of folks try to argue that capitalism can be reformed, that capitalists can be restrained through regulation and legislation that would put limits on the abuses capitalists can make to the people of the world and to our environment. This liberal position cruelly ignores the fact that even the most effective regulations and reforms do nothing to correct the power imbalances of society. Any such reforms are destined to be inadequate because they don't disrupt who ultimately holds the power in the system. As long as capitalists hold the...
So I'm going to agree with him on this, and not for the reasons that he thinks. The reason I agree with him is that regulations often create the very monopolies that we seek to prevent. What happens is governments can get in the way of business and actually help bigger businesses crush little businesses. A good example of this is if a big business wants some regulation that they can easily pay for through, they're a big company, they have lots of money, they can pay for some regulation. For example, with my own company, my company is relatively small. It's just me working from home, and I have employees in offices locally and overseas. But I work personally from home. And with my business, I was told by the government that because I had so many employees, and this regulation was to protect people and make business more accessible and all this kind of wonderful stuff. And they said that I needed to have a wheelchair ramp. So I needed to add a wheelchair ramp to my house, even though I never dealt with anyone at my house which had any accessibility issues, where there was no reason to have an accessibility problem. There was no need for a wheelchair ramp. So it was insane, and it would have cost my business about $30,000 to put in a wheelchair ramp. So what happened was I had to fight with the government and say, hey, look, this doesn't make any sense. It's going to hurt my business. It's going to put me out of business because it's just waste of my time and waste of my money. So after arguing for about 3 months with the government, I managed to get an exemption where my business didn't have to have the wheelchair ramp. Well, that wheelchair ramp is a regulation that could have destroyed my business. Big businesses could easily afford that. They have much bigger offices. Having one wheelchair ramp isn't such a big deal to them. But as a small business, it was a huge deal. And this is something that is just one example out of many, many examples of how regulations can really destroy business. And they act as barriers to entry, because if you have to pay for all these costs to do business, well, only the biggest players are going to be able to afford that. So basically, all the little guys get pushed out of the market and never have a chance to become bigger companies that can break up monopolies that exist. So another good example of this was Ma Bell. When the US government and the Canadian government decided that the phone system should be considered a utility that is regulated, strongly regulated by the US government and the Canadian government, what happened was they created a monopoly, a government monopoly of the phone systems within North America. And basically what ended up happening was technology went stagnant. I remember in my parents' home, their phone was basically the same for 30, 40 years. It was insane. They always had the same phone that the phone company would provide. And they would rent it and they would pay the fee to have this phone that was really archaic. And that was the way it was. And it was very expensive. Long distance was horrendously expensive. Making simple, paying that simple monthly fee for a landline was utterly expensive. And it was because there was no competition. We couldn't say, hey, this is insane. Well, I want to go to some other company. Well, there was no other company. It was a monopoly. And it was a monopoly controlled by the government. Now, when they deregulated it, they got rid of the regulations that created the monopoly. All of a sudden, you had thousands of companies entering into the phone market, and there was like all of a sudden huge number of phone varieties. Within a few years, there was like the cell phones. There was all this technology that came about very, very quickly, and there was more options, and the prices went down significantly. So long distance, barely costs anything nowadays. And it's because of deregulation that monopolies were actually broken up from deregulation, not from regulations. So I'm going to play more of his video, and we'll listen to more of his arguments.
The reins of the means of production, they will always hold virtually limitless power over society. Another major myth about capitalism is the idea of meritocracy. Capitalist propaganda seeks to convince us that hard work and good ideas will rise to the top, and that anyone can become a rich capitalist if they're willing to play the game. Unfortunately, that game is severely rigged, such that for every worker who does manage to break into the capitalist caste of billionaires, there are millions of workers who suffer and toil in misery from the cradle to the grave. Some folks say that if we got rid of capitalism, universal laziness would take over society and nobody would work anymore because there'd be no incentive. This position ignores the fact that in capitalist society, the people who work the hardest make the least amount of money, and the people with the greatest fortunes, the capitalists, live out their days in luxurious laziness. Capitalism is an engine that robs wealth from the working people of the world and transfers it to a small number of capitalists who feel entitled to our money. It had its time and place in history. It was admittedly a great step forward from feudalism, but it's outworn its usefulness, and now's the time for capitalism to be dismantled so that humanity can fulfill our true potential. There's a lot more to be said about capitalism. In my next video, we'll talk more about wages and profits and how capitalists steal the labor value.
Okay, so he sums up at the end there with talking about how capitalism basically is an outdated system that's not really good, and there's better systems that can come into play. Obviously, he's suggesting socialism, and that we know is not true, because if you look at history, there hasn't been a better system. Capitalism actually is a pretty good system once it's sort of let alone. The problem is people keep on saying how bad of a system it is, and they try to regulate it and put government controls in it, and they muck it up. Let the free market be a free market, and things will be generally pretty good. It won't be perfect, but it's better than any of the other systems that we've experienced in history. One other notion that I have to debunk is this idea that the hardest working are the workers and the evil capitalists are these people that are just sitting on yachts and not really doing very much. That does happen, but it's not as frequent as you might think. Most capitalists work very, very hard. The typical capitalist works about 80 hours a week on average, whereas the typical worker works about 40 hours a week. So it's not that the capitalist isn't working hard. They're actually working very hard, and they're taking a huge risk. The worker just gets a paycheck at the end of the day, whereas the capitalist risks their own money and might not even get a paycheck at the end of the day. So this notion of the capitalist sitting on a yacht or having it just easy, they don't have to do much, is just not realistic. It's just not the way it is. It happens, sure, but it's very rare. So, and if you saw my life, you'd be like, okay, capitalist lives are not that easy, because I work generally about over 100, 120 hours a week. And that's not that unusual, but it is what it is. I enjoy what I do, and I think most capitalists do, and they try to do it for good reasons. There are bad people out there, but there are bad people on every side of the coin. There's workers that are lazy. There's capitalists that are lazy. It's just the way life is. Nobody's perfect. So this has been Socially Triggered. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry for the strange order for how I reviewed Noncompete's videos, but I hope I showed that capitalism doesn't suck. And if you have any arguments for why capitalism does suck, or why what Noncompete was saying is true, please comment below and check out my other videos. There's so much more that I talk about that is cool and worthy of checking out. So I recommend you check out all my videos. And thank you for listening. Bye for now.